Morning, everybody. You can tell by the change of the background here, we are actually in room 406 today. We're in the classroom, and just by looking in the background, looks like we're getting some glare. So I'm just gonna quickly close this. Much better. Cool. Okay. So today is May 5th. Which is a Tuesday, and it's the start of our new week in the packet. So if you take a look in the front, you'll see that we have a reading guide. It's going to be the last one that you're going to have for Latin America. And I'll be saying it throughout the course of the week to remind you, and I'll send an email and all that stuff. But I'm going to expect that you send that Latin American textbook back to school next Monday. And we do have all of the numbers cataloged as to which one that you have. Okay, and I want you to remember that. So if I don't get a particular number back, we know what number you're assigned, and it's going to be in your best interest to turn those in, because otherwise I do have to ask that you pay to replace the book, because I only have enough copies right now for 100 students, and there are 95 of you. Okay, so I do need those back. That being said, let's jump into what we're doing to start this week. We're going to be talking about our last Latin American revolution that's in our textbook today, and that is going to be that of Brazil. Now, if we remember, Brazil in the beginning is already different than the other Latin American countries that we've talked about, because the predominant language, and still is to this day, is Portuguese and not Spanish, right? And Haiti had French be their primary language, which is why we call it Latin American, right? It's the fact that all three of these nationalities and these languages come from Latin. So in order to group them all together, people refer to this geographic region of the world as Latin America. All right. So we have May 5th. Your warm-up today is asking you, is it possible for there to be a revolution outside of the lower classes of the Spanish encomienda system? So outside of, Creoles, mixed race, or as we say, even though it's not politically correct, mestizo or native, is it possible for peninsulares or even royals to start their own revolution? And the answer to that question is absolutely. It's very rare, and it wouldn't seem like it's possible because they already have everything, right? So why would they do that? And the answer is actually going to become pretty clear here in just a second. I just want you to know today's reading guide is going to be due on Thursday, because we're going to have a quiz on Thursday, and we're going to have a review day tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to do all of these questions. It's 1 through 16. Make sure you get the vocab done and turn it in electronically if you can. Make sure you still do the exit ticket today, though. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, right here, what are we looking at? Well, this is Europe shook up in the early 1800s. And I'm pretty sure we've talked about this enough that when we talk about Europe going to war in the 1800s, we know who's responsible. And even though he isn't from there, he's coming from this kingdom here. It's Napoleon, right? And I really like this map because it shows the campaigns or the travel routes that Napoleon went through in the early 1800s. Anything that you see here besides Britain doesn't count, but besides anything that's colored, Napoleon is either going to take at some point, they are going to be fighting with him, or he's going to be there for a period of time, as we see in the Russian Empire, okay? But our focus today is going to be right here down to the west in the Kingdom of Portugal. Okay, now Napoleon is going to initially come through Spain. He doesn't really use Navy that much. He's usually more primarily an army officer. So he's coming by land, taking Spain, and then coming into Portugal. Portugal, even though they are definitely known for being people that take to the sea, they're maritime navigators and explorers. They're not known for having a very strong standing army, which is why they and Spain were closely allied. And they're going to lose very quickly. And the prince of that time, his name was João, which is an interesting name. It's actually Portuguese translated to English would be John. So this is Joao the Sixth, or John the Sixth. I'm going to call him Joao. So Joao in 1808, he needs to leave Portugal as Napoleon is coming in. And Joao and Portugal, they really have one particular colony that they can go to, that they can be safe in, and that's right here, okay? And this is in Brazil. So Brazil is by far their most wealthy colony, and just like with Saint-Domingue, which will become Haiti, they have one particular crop that they grow a lot of, and that's sugar, okay? And they do have other things that make money there too, but as we know, when it comes to sugar production, it's not very kind to the people that actually produce it, okay? So they end up sailing in 1808, Joao and his wife and family, and they're going to hang out here for a while, or at least that's the plan, right? Eventually things will die down, and they hope they can go back. Now, when Joao gets there, the first thing that happens is that his wife, and you'll see this in your textbook, his wife has to shave her head. And the reason that that happens is because they had to load up very quickly. And when they sailed over from Portugal to Brazil, the conditions there were not very good. And a lot of things went bad, and there was a huge lice outbreak on the boat. So the reason that she had to shave her head is because she had gotten lice on the ship, and back then there was no shampoo that you could use to get it out. Okay, so she does look a little funky in the picture that you see, and it's also in your reading guide, but the answer is that the reason she shaved her head is because she had gotten lice on the way to Brazil. Okay, so things didn't start off all too great, but eventually what ends up happening is that when in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, which is in this area, Joao ends up seeing something, and he's really, really saddened by it. At the time when you had a colony, you would restrict its ability to trade with anybody else, because your hope is that you're going to grow raw products or mine raw products and send it to the colonial kingdom. So for Brazil, it would be to Portugal. And then they would only allow the Brazilians to buy goods that were made from the Portuguese. And that's so that they can get a consistent system of trade, and it'll make the people in Portugal richer. And the sad truth is that it makes the people in Brazil more dependent on Portugal. Now, when you live over in Portugal, that's pretty easy to forget about. When Joao lives in Brazil, he realizes just how awful it is. It's completely crippled the economy over in Brazil. People are very poor, they're starving, and they don't have access to much of anything. So what Joao decides to do while he's in Brazil is, because he's the prince, he can open the ports to other kingdoms, which is what he does. And Brazil ends up becoming very, very wealthy as a result of it. And eventually, Joao starts building a whole bunch of buildings that you would only see really in Europe at the time. Universities, hospitals, museums of natural history even. And it's kind of becoming like a European kingdom in South America. And Joao eventually decides, hey, I've done so much here and I've seen this place grow, and I'm the main political leader here in Brazil. I want to stay here. And the problem is that eventually Napoleon is defeated, and the kingdoms that he had taken beforehand, they all started to self-rule again. And Portugal was one of those. Well, the Portuguese king was now gone, Joao's dad, so he needed to take over. So he has a son named Pedro. This would be him as a very young man. And he says to Pedro, look, man, I understand that I have to go back, and there are all these other South American countries that are rebelling right now against their king. If you hear anything about this, I want you to stay here, and I want you to declare independence yourself. That way we can continue to hold it as a family, and you'll be the leader of this awesome nation that I love so much. And that's exactly what ends up happening. And once there are whispers of revolution in Brazil, Pedro makes himself the leader. He gets up, he has a Portuguese flag on his military uniform, and he rips it off with his bare hand and says to them, we are going to fight the Portuguese crown to become independent on our own. Well, Joao, though being very popular, he ends up staying over in Portugal, And the force that comes to find Pedro is really, really small because he's a popular person. The family is popular. This really isn't that much of a drastic change. And Pedro ends up defeating them pretty easily. Now, there are going to be some other foreign invasions and things are going to be a little bit dicey, but for the most part, Brazil ends up being very stable because all they're doing is just going from one royal family or one royal person to another, and they end up becoming a Brazilian empire. Now, Pedro is going to pass away not too long after Brazil gets independence, but his son, Pedro II, is going to end up taking over. And Brazil is going to be an empire all the way until 1889, which is much longer than all the other countries. We're talking like 60, 70 years after these other countries we had talked about. Okay. This ends up becoming the Brazilian flag during the time of the empire. And there are a couple things to point out. Number one, this is one of the Portuguese seals, and it talks about bringing the world together. And the reason that it looks like this and that band is around the world is because Portugal had already sailed out and explored many areas around the world. So it's a symbol for that. You have a cross because Portugal was very, very strongly Christian, Catholic, actually. And you have this huge crown in the middle of the Brazilian flag. And I think that's to show, hey, look, just because we've had a little bit of a change of scenery here and Portugal is not the head of Brazil anymore, we want you to remember, we still have a royal family, okay? And we are still led by a monarch. And the boughs of holly here, these are going to signify the hope of luck, which is going to be pretty important to put on a flag at a time when you have a new empire that's done something that really no other place has, just taking your king and replacing it with the crown prince. Now, Pedro is going to see a lot of stability in his reign as well. But what ends up becoming an issue for him is in the late 1800s, he ends up getting into a fight with people that were former Creoles. And the fight is over slavery. And oddly enough, Pedro actually is trying to get rid of slavery. Brazil, as you remember from the video yesterday, Brazil had 40% of all of the slaves brought from Africa into their country. And Pedro saw firsthand just how awful that it was. But the problem is that the former Creoles, they really wanted to continue to have that power over slaves. And they wanted to have their haciendas or their plantations continue to have a lot of profit. So he ends up being forced to step down by these wealthy people, not because he's someone who wants to continue slavery, but because he wants to stop it. But I think Brazil is an interesting case because in the end, we do really see that they have a very stable system. And there's much less to talk about when it comes to Brazil, mainly because it just takes a couple of people. And even though there'll be a republic after, they only have Pedro I and II to be their rulers during almost all of the 19th century. Now, Latin America, it's an interesting region, right? And besides Brazil, really, we have all of these revolutions pop up, and it's all about self-governing, right? The ability to be free, to make your own decisions based on where you live, and the rebellion against race as a means to try to determine where you are in society, okay? And the United States is going to have its own problems with this, right? And its own struggle for this. And you could argue it's still happening, right? But I wanted to really take some time to go into these Latin American revolutions because, ladies and gentlemen, splitting people on the basis of race is wrong, okay? And even though we know that and we see that, when we get into Jim Crow, when you're in Mr. Wongard's class next year and we talk about racial injustice, the world really didn't learn its lesson, right? And if that's the case, we need to continue to teach this because for some reason, it doesn't seem like throughout periods of history that it's sunk in yet. People should be able to do what they do depending on their ability and their willingness to try to achieve, right? Which is why each and every one of you are given a public education, right? It's about giving you the opportunity, no matter what your background is, in the hope that you can maximize your potential, okay? And Latin America, during its time of revolution, shows a lot of people that are willing to try to challenge just that, okay? Ladies and gentlemen, I just want you to remember tomorrow's a review day. Reading guides due on Thursday. Don't forget to do that exit ticket immediately following this. Me and Pedro are going to bid you an adieu and see you tomorrow. Have a good one.